to the next. This is not a political game, and those who continue to play these games need to stop and get to work with us to move our economy forward. Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, thank you. As the Senator from Wisconsin has so eloquently said, we are indeed nearing the brink of the self-imposed catastrophes of government shutdown or government default or both. And unless Speaker Boehner can find a way to restrain his right-wing Tea Party extremists, find a way to work sensibly with Democrats, and steer us back from the brink, then an unnecessary and self-imposed calamity awaits. I should probably be more specific. It's not just self-imposed, it's Tea Party imposed. And while we try to find our way around this unnecessary Tea Party imposed disaster, a real disaster is looming. It's a real disaster. It's really looming, and we could address it. Instead, we're having to fend off totally unnecessary disasters cooked up by right-wing Tea Party extremists. It is infuriating. When the real disaster has fully hit us, folks will look back at this era and they will wonder, what was wrong with them? Who were those people? The warnings were everywhere and they did nothing. Instead, they wasted time threatening each other with cooked-up calamities rather than deal with the real disasters. That's disgraceful. And they'll be right. Of course, the real and looming disaster is what unprecedented levels of carbon pollution and unprecedented levels of atmospheric carbon are doing to our weather and our oceans. That's for real. That's Mother Nature. That's not just political gamesmanship and hostage-taking. And that is what brings me here now for the 44th time to say it is time for us to wake up to the threat of climate change. While Congress keeps sleepwalking on this issue, I'm proud to say that President Obama has woken up. Last week, his administration announced important new carbon pollution standards for future power plants. These standards will reduce the carbon pollution that's been wreaking havoc on our oceans, our atmosphere, and our health. Those of us who believe in science and who are awake to the changes already happening all around us should rally behind the President and EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy to support these proposed standards. Just look at the evidence of what carbon pollution is doing to our planet. According to news articles, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, will soon announce that it is now more certain than ever that human activity is the main cause of the recent climate changes we have seen. This may surprise some of my Republican colleagues who've tried pointing to a recent slowdown in surface temperature as evidence that climate change has stopped. According to the IPCC, this phase is, unfortunately, only temporary, as other slowdowns have been in the past. If you look at the history of global warming and of temperature, you can see that across time you can add steps in because of the variability that is inherent in our climate. But nobody could look at that and not see the constant rising thread that runs through it. No regression analysis, to use the technical term, would not show that global warming is real. And the fact that we are at a step is, well, here's what Richard Muller, noted physics professor at UC Berkeley, has to say in an article that came out today. He quoted himself from 2004 when he wrote, "If we mistakenly believe that natural fluctuations in climate are small, then we might conclude mistakenly that the cooling could not be just a random fluctuation on top of a long-term warming trend. And that might lead in turn to the mistaken conclusion that global warming predictions are a lot of hooey. If, on the other hand, we recognize that natural fluctuations can be large, then we will not be misled by a few years of random cooling, which has happened over and over through the progression of climate change. He followed on today. The frequent rises and falls, virtually a stair-step pattern, are part of the historic record, and there is no expectation that they will stop whatever their cause. The land temperature record is full of fits and starts that make the upward trend vanish for short periods. Regardless of whether we understand them, there is no reason to expect them to stop. The current pause, he concludes, is consistent with numerous prior pauses. When walking upstairs in a tall building, it is a mistake to interpret a landing as the end of the climb. Whatever the cause of these recurring steps, even contrarian scientists recognize the principle that is operating here. More carbon dioxide leads to more warming. It's as simple as that. That's a 150-year-old established basic principle of physics. And the oceans, which I talk about a lot in these speeches, have a lot to do with this. The deep oceans absorb excess heat, saving us from a lot more heat here on the surface. Researchers say oceans have absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat over the last 50 years. If the ocean has absorbed this much of the heat, think what a small fluctuation in what the ocean is doing will do to our atmospheric temperature. 93.4%, only 2.3%. You don't have to wiggle this much in order to create the kind of steps and changes and oscillations that we've seen in the step stair of climate change. Oceans don't just absorb the heat, they also absorb about 30% of our carbon emissions, chemically. Emissions that would otherwise be in our atmosphere causing more warming. Absorbing those emissions has already made the oceans more acidic, with dangerous consequences for marine life as this continues. But it spared us even more extreme climate effects here on land. Environment America just recently released a report earlier this month highlighting the power sector's pollution, which creates an enormous amount of this. In 2011, 5.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide were emitted in the United States. The blue circle is the whole country. Just over 40% of that total, 2.2 billion tons, came from the power sector. That's the green sector. The inner circle, the red one, is the emissions just from the 50 dirtiest power plants in America. 1 out of every 8 tons of America's carbon dioxide emissions, the ones that are causing these changes in the ocean, the ones that are causing these changes in the atmosphere, come from these filthy 50 power plants, like luminant generation company's Martin Lake plant in Texas, emitting the equivalent of 3.9 million cars emissions. Or Alabama Power Company's James H. Miller Jr. plant, emitting the equivalent of 4.3 million cars emissions. Or the champion, Georgia Power's Shearer plant, the largest emitter of carbon pollution in America, which emits as much carbon pollution as 4.4 million cars. If these 50 plants were an independent country, that country would alone be the 7th largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world, just behind Germany, just ahead of South Korea. From my state's perspective, these out-of-state power plants are a hazard. It is out-of-state power plants that emit the chemicals that turn into ground-level ozone in downwind Rhode Island. Rhode Islanders pay the price, particularly on bad air days, and we've had 6 of them so far in 2013. About 12% of Rhode Island's children and 11% of our adults suffer from asthma, and ground-level ozone puts them at greater risk. We've got a lot of good Rhode Island reasons to clean up the power sector. That's why I support the administration's proposed standards for new power plants. The standards will limit the effects of climate change on future generations by telling polluting industries it's time to clean up your act. It's time to stop dumping toxic carbon pollution. It's time to get responsible about what you are doing to our environment and our health, to our children, our oceans, and our atmosphere. We can still avoid the worst outcomes of climate change. Some changes can't be avoided. Some are already happening. But if we act now, we can avoid the worst predictions for heat waves, sea level rise, ocean acidification, storms, and other disruptions. That's why we in Congress should support the President's goal to reduce U.S. emissions to 17% below our 2005 output by the end of this decade and to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. The standards for new power plants are a good first step, but we also need to clean up existing power plants, particularly these 50, which I'll remind everybody emit more carbon dioxide than South Korea. And we should get serious here in Congress and fix the market failure in our power sector that ignores the true costs of burning these fossil fuels. We should pass carbon fee legislation. What do we see instead here in Congress? Well, here's an example. Last week, a House subcommittee hearing on the President's Climate Action Plan brought out these wildly misleading statements. We can say over 40 years we've got almost no increase in temperature, went one. The Arctic ice has actually increased by 60%, went another. In reality, surface temperatures are up about 1 full degree Fahrenheit over the last 40 years. And that increase in Arctic sea level, in Arctic sea ice, I should say, is only relative to last year's all-time record low. The National Snow and Ice Data Center reported that this year's summer minimum is the 6th lowest in the 34 years records have been kept, and it is right in line with the long-term, rapidly declining ice cover trend. The Republicans did a lot of complaining at the hearing about the President's Climate Action Plan. To my Republican colleagues who don't like the President's plan, I say, come to the table. Let's negotiate climate legislation in Congress. Republicans in Congress should support a carbon fee, as many Republicans outside of Congress do. If you don't like polluting interests having to bear 100% of the cost of complying with the carbon pollution standards, let's look at a carbon fee. A carbon fee, by contrast, would give those same companies an opportunity to work with Congress to share in some of the revenue generated by the fee. Or the revenue could be returned to the American people as a tax cut, if Republicans prefer, even as a corporate tax cut, if Republicans prefer. Or we could use that revenue to forgive all federal student debt in this country. Forgive all federal student debt in this country. What a shot in the arm that would be to our economy. Or we could give struggling seniors a $1,600 Social Security raise. There are a lot of wonderful things that could be done, but my colleagues must first come to the table. What they can't do is deny. To deny is to lie, and the time for that is past. It is time to wake up. I thank the presiding officer, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that this hour of time for the Republicans be divided as follows. First, for myself, 12 minutes, then Senator Hatch, 15 minutes, Senator Portman, 10 minutes, Senator Coates, 10 minutes, Senator Toomey, 10 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise again in strong support of my no Washington exemption from Obamacare amendment. I have refiled it on the CR, which is before us, the spending bill, and it is a germane amendment as I've filed it to the CR. It's amendment number 1983. Mr. President, again, we're on a timetable, a collision course, where unless we act, a horrible policy and an illegal Obama administration rule will go into effect. And so it is important that we vote and we act, and we do that now. That's why, Mr. President, as soon as we came back from the August recess, I brought this to the attention of the Senate and the Congress and the country, and I demanded a vote. It wasn't my choice to be on that tight timetable. Certainly wasn't my choice of the administration issue a draft illegal rule, but that is where we are, and so we must vote and act before October 1st. And so after being blocked out of a vote on that on the previous matter on the floor, the energy efficiency bill, blocked out for 2 weeks by the distinguished majority leader and others. After being blocked out from that, I bring it again in the context of this spending bill as a germane amendment, number 1983, to this spending bill. Again, Mr. President, the principle is clear. And to me, it's the first principle of democracy. In our case of the United States of America, what's good for America should be good for Washington, and what is applied to America should absolutely be applied in the same way to Washington, across the board, certainly including Obamacare. Mr. President, we had a debate about that several years ago during the Obamacare debate, and actually that concept at least won out, and we were able to add a Grassley amendment to the bill, which was passed into final law. I was a strong supporter of that language. Was somewhat amazed that we got it included, but we did in the democratic process, and it is now part of the law, part of the statute. And that law says clearly, unequivocally, every member of Congress, every official congressional staff has to go to the exchange for their health care, the same fallback plan as is there for the American people under Obamacare. I advocated for that strongly since the very beginning of the Obamacare debate. Whatever the fallback plan for America is, that should be the plan for Washington. That should be the plan. No other choices, no special privileges or exemptions or subsidies for Washington. And so that was part of the statute that passed into law. But I guess, Mr. President, it was a classic case of what Nancy Pelosi said: we need to pass the law in order to figure out what's in it. Because after it passed, a lot of folks on Capitol Hill read that provision and said, oh, you know what, we can't live with this. We can't let this stand. We need to, quote, unquote, fix this. And so there was furious scheming and furious lobbying to fix that simple concept that what applies to America should apply to Washington. Where that ended up after months of scheming and lobbying was the President of the United States, President Obama, getting personally involved. This is confirmed in numerous news reports, and making sure, ordering his administration to issue a special rule to save Congress from this horrible fate that's being visited on at least 8 million Americans. And so right as Congress was leaving for the August recess, conveniently getting out of town, away from the scene of the crime, the Obama administration issued this draft rule. And in my opinion, it is clearly, unequivocally illegal because it's in conflict with the language of the statute. The rule does two things. First of all, even though the statute says clearly that every member of Congress and all official congressional staff go to the exchange, the draft rule says, well, we don't know what official staff is, so we're going to leave that up to every individual member of Congress to decide who on his or her staff is official staff for purposes of this provision. We're never going to second-guess them. So in theory, a member of Congress can say, well, my committee staff is an official staff. My leadership staff is an official staff. In fact, in theory, under this proposed rule, a member of Congress can say nobody on my staff is, quote, official staff for purposes of this provision. And OPM has made clear we're not going to second-guess that. That's ridiculous on its face. And second, Mr. President, the rule says for members and any staff who do go to the exchange, they get to take a big, fat, taxpayer-funded subsidy with them, subsidy that's completely unavailable to any other American at that income level going to the exchange. That's not in the statute at all. That's contrary to the statute, the letter, the law, the spirit. That's contrary to it completely. And again, Mr. President, that's what provoked me to act with many other members. And I want to recognize and thank all of the co-sponsors of this important legislation on the Senate side, and also Congressman DeSantis of Florida and all House co-sponsors of identical legislation on the House side. So our fix is simple, and it's basic, and it's important. And it is, first of all, let's live by the law with regard to Congress. So every member of Congress, all congressional official staff have to go to the exchange as mandated by law with no special deal, exemption, subsidy, only what's available to other Americans going to the exchange. The whole purpose of that language was for Congress to feel the dislocation and inconvenience and experience of millions of other Americans going to the exchange, 8 million or more going there against their will. They had health care. They had employer-provided health care. They heard the President say if you have coverage that you like, you can keep it. And they found out that was a big lie. And now they're losing that and going to the exchange. The whole purpose of the language was that Congress walk in their shoes. And this amendment goes further and applies the same principle of fairness to the administration, says the President, the Vice President, all of their political appointees do the same thing. Go to the exchange for their health care, just like every other American does. No special deals, exemptions, subsidies, no special rules. Now, Mr. President, again, this is very time sensitive because this rule is set to be made final October 1st. That's not my choice. I think the rule is flat out illegal. That's a decision or an action of the administration, but it does demand that we vote and act now. That's why, Mr. President, as soon as we came back from the August recess and went back into session, I filed the fix, and I demanded a proper up or down vote. Unfortunately, that was blocked out for 2 weeks by the distinguished majority leader, and so I come to the floor again in the context of this spending bill. Very appropriate to have the debate on this spending bill. This is spending we're talking about. I filed it as a germane amendment to this spending bill, and we need a full debate and vote on this matter before October 1st. Now, Mr. President, interestingly, in the previous bill, after locking me out of any vote, the distinguished majority leader said he had no problem with a vote on this, clean, up or down. I guess he said that in theory because it never happened in practice. But this is a perfect, opportune, appropriate time to have that up or down vote. Won't delay anything. It's perfectly appropriate that it be on the spending bill. This is a germane amendment. And so, Mr. President, I urge us to vote and act and not block out this debate and not block out this vote. My request is as simple and basic and straightforward as that. And I think it's consistent with the distinguished majority leader's promise that we'd have a vote. He said that. Again, that must have been in theory because he blocked it in practice. So, Mr. President, in that spirit, I ask unanimous consent that the pending amendments be set aside and it be in order to call up my amendment numbered 1983.
The senator from Montana. The objection is heard.
Mr. President, reclaiming my time, I just think that's very unfortunate. It's very inconsistent with what the distinguished majority leader said. We need a debate. We need a vote on this matter. It should happen before October 1st, and it will happen. I can guarantee you that. I don't know when. I don't know if it'll be before October 1st, but it will happen. We will have this debate and vote. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, it's no secret that the so-called Affordable Care Act is a train wreck waiting to happen. Some of it's already happened. We know that. The American people know that. My constituents all over Utah know that. But sadly, the President of the United States doesn't seem to know it. In fact, the President is out today trying to convince the American people that his signature domestic achievement is a winner. Few people believe him, however, and no amount of spin on his part will change that. Frankly, Republicans have been saying Obamacare would be a disaster since well before it was enacted. Indeed, if you look back at the original debates over Obamacare, you'll find that we predicted virtually all of the problems we're seeing now as the administration attempts to implement this poorly crafted law. Let's just take a look at some of the predictions that we made. We predicted, for example, that in order to avoid the employer mandate, businesses would cease hiring new workers and that they would move existing employees to part-time. Obamacare requires employers with 50 or more full-time employees to offer their workers health coverage of a minimum value or pay a penalty. As we predicted, a number of small businesses, which are the main job creators in this country, are simply opting to unilaterally limit their full-time employees in order to avoid the mandate. Just think about that, Mr. President. We have the lowest labor participation rate since the Carter administration, but instead of working to create the jobs that American families and workers need, more and more businesses have stopped hiring to avoid the costs that come with Obamacare. The law defines, quote, full-time, unquote, employees as those working more than 30 hours a week. As a result of this bizarre definition, many employers have opted to simply cap workers' hours. That is happening everywhere, Mr. President. It's happening in the private sector and among public schools and municipalities. In fact, it's happening so often that even the leaders of big labor, who are among the biggest supporters of Obamacare, have publicly argued that the law is destroying the 40-hour work week. That's just one Republican prediction about Obamacare that came true. We also predicted that Obamacare would cause people who currently have health insurance to lose it. We all remember the President's infamous promise that, quote, if you like your plan, you can keep it, unquote. Sadly, our post-Obamacare experience hasn't borne that out. At the time, Republicans said that there was no way that he could fulfill that promise, and we were right. According to the Congressional Budget Office, millions of Americans are likely to lose their current employer-provided health insurance under the President's health law. We also predicted that the costs of health insurance premiums would skyrocket as insurance companies struggle to comply with all of the new mandates under the law. This is also happening. Numerous studies have shown that the cost of premiums have continued to go up since Obamacare was passed and are predicted to go up even further next year as the law is more fully implemented. The question is, how high are the costs going to go? Yesterday, the administration released a report claiming that Obamacare is bringing down the cost of health insurance premiums. Specifically, the report claims that premiums, quote, will be 16% lower than predicted or projected, unquote. Well, Mr. President, lower than projected is not the same as lower than they are now. If you compare the cost of Obamacare health plans with the cost of plans available on the market today, It is indisputable that the costs are going up under the law. The administration is free to cherry-pick data in order to make the best case possible. Indeed, that's what they've done with this most recent report. However, even when they cite the most favorable data available, we see that Obamacare is making health insurance premiums more expensive in this country. And when you look at the more complete picture of the data, you'll find that it's even worse. As the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research recently found, individual market premiums will increase 99% for men and 62% for women nationwide under Obamacare. This, once again, was not unforeseen. While the President was claiming that his health care plan would reduce premiums by an average of $2,500 a year, Republicans predicted the costs would actually go up under the law. As it turns out, we were right on that one, too. Republicans also predicted that health care spending would increase as the result of Obamacare. The President, as you recall, promised that the law would lower the cost of health care. However, health care spending is projected to increase dramatically as a result of Obamacare. Republicans also predicted that Obamacare would increase the deficit. And wouldn't you know it, the former director of CBO has projected that the health law will add $500 billion to the deficit in the first 10 years and more than $1.5 trillion in the second decade. We predicted that middle-class families would see their taxes go up as a result of Obamacare. And if you look at the law, you'll see that it includes no fewer than 11 taxes and penalties that directly impact the middle class, including taxes on medical devices, prescription drugs, and flexible spending accounts. In addition, Republicans predicted that health insurance exchanges, where people go to sign up for Obamacare's mandated insurance, and the system of verifying and approving premium and cost-sharing subsidies for people in those exchanges would be a nightmare to manage. This has been confirmed time and time again as the administration has continually missed deadlines and offered only scant details as to how these exchanges are going to work, even as they are set to go live on October 1st. Studies from the Government Accountability Office have confirmed that the exchanges are not likely to be ready in time. In fact, just yesterday, the District of Columbia announced that it will be delaying the implementation of its exchange because of, quote, high error rates, unquote. Two other states, Idaho and Minnesota, also might delay their exchanges. During the debate over Obamacare, Republicans predicted that despite all the claims that, quote, health care reform is entitlement reform, unquote, the law would not shore up our unsustainable entitlement programs. We're set to spend more than $10 trillion on Medicare and Medicaid over the next 10 years. The CBO has called our health care entitlements our, quote, fundamental fiscal challenge, unquote. And according to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, the President's health law hasn't done anything, has not done anything to diminish the problems facing these massive programs. So like I said, Mr. President, none of the problems we're seeing today were unforeseen. Republicans predicted all of these difficulties years ago. We weren't psychic. We just know how markets work. And more importantly, we've learned from experience just how inept government can be when it ventures into uncharted territory. The Democrats who drafted this monstrosity and forced it through Congress either didn't understand the inherent problems with the legislation or they just plain didn't care. I suspect it was a little of both. At the time, they were more concerned with just getting something passed so the President could claim victory on one of his central campaign promises that they were passing something that would actually work. And now we're all seeing the results, and only part of the results. I'm only mentioning a few things here today. Nearly every week, we learn of another problem the administration is having with implementing Obamacare. Like I said, we constantly hear announcements that certain elements of the law are going to be delayed. We've heard this about the employer mandate, the small business health insurance market, and employee automatic enrollment in the exchanges. And we got the latest announcement just today, Madam President. Today we found out that the Obama administration is postponing online enrollment in some of the small business exchanges that were scheduled to open this coming Tuesday. The administration makes these delay announcements almost nonchalantly, never acknowledging that they are indications of a larger problem with the law. Instead, they simply press forward, ignoring the warning signs and pushing our nation's health care system even further towards the cliff. It's clear what needs to be done here, Madam President. It's not complicated or convoluted. On the contrary, it's quite simple. This law needs to be eliminated, and Congress should do whatever is in its power to get that done. This has been my position since the day the law was passed, and it continues to be my position today. I've supported repealing Obamacare. I've supported delaying it, and I support defunding it. I've introduced multiple pieces of legislation that would repeal the most egregious parts of Obamacare, including the individual mandate, the employer mandate, the medical device tax, and the health insurance tax. With days to go before the exchanges go live on October 1st, I have legislation backed by 31 of my colleagues delaying them until the GAO can certify that private and personal information of consumers and patients will be secure. I've come here to the floor on numerous occasions to call for either repeal or a permanent delay to the implementation of the law. And regardless of how the debate over the continuing resolution plays out, I will continue to do so. Madam President, this law costs more and will do far less than was promised when the bill was first drafted, debated, and passed. The Democrats who wrote this law and forced it through Congress may have thought that the American people were naive enough to believe all the promises that came with Obamacare, but from the beginning, polls have shown that the majority of Americans do not support it, and with good cause. That's why I've publicly applauded the House of Representatives for passing its continuing resolution that defunds Obamacare. Getting rid of Obamacare is just the first step. Once we do that, we need to work together on a bipartisan basis to find a way to reduce health care costs for the American people while also making sure that we cover the American people. We've seen what happens when one party tries to fix health care on its own. What we got was a disaster of a law that has actually increased health care costs, all while imposing new taxes and mandates on the American people and creating chaos in the entire American health care system. The American people deserve better, Madam President, and the legislation before us today is the first step toward giving them that. Now, I understand that the Democrats are going to peel out the one provision that we all in the Republican side support. Everyone on the Republican side supports defunding of Obamacare and starting over and doing it right and doing it in a bipartisan way instead of this partisan way that has wound up with the biggest fiasco that I've seen around here in all my 37 years in Congress. I'm concerned, Madam President. We can do better. This has become too much of a partisan exercise, and frankly, I'm very concerned that our country is going to really suffer because some of our friends just think they've got to continue to support this dog of a bill, even though day after day after day we find more and more reasons to oppose it. Well, we brought these things out before. Maybe not some of these, because some of these have just occurred just in the last day, as a matter of fact. Think of the fraud and think of the open door for scam artists, because they're going to go ahead on October 1st with individuals saying that they think it's fine, but there has been no independent verification done by this administration or by anybody to make sure that the private information of our individual citizens is protected. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace that we're letting them get away with it. And it's a disgrace that's going to come back to hammer us as members of Congress who didn't do our job right in the first place and who continuously keep supporting a bill that's eating us alive. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Probably a lot more rich than what I would say. Hey, honey, how's the dog?
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, in the next couple of days, we're going to have a chance on the floor of the Senate.
Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate come out of the quorum call and go into regular.
Without objection.
Madam President, next couple of days, we're going to have a chance to vote on Obamacare. And this will be an opportunity for us to allow our views to be expressed on both sides of the aisle. I'm glad we're going to have that opportunity. We'll see what happens, but I think it's certainly an opportunity for us to have a good debate about why we think it's important for us not just to change Obamacare, but actually to start over and do this right. It's a time for us to undo the mistake that this Senate made 3 years ago when that legislation was jammed through the process without a single Republican vote, by the way, which is something that the American people are tired of. The partisanship in that particular vote, I think, has led to a bad result. Obamacare was sold, by the way, to the nation under false pretenses. We were promised that Obamacare would bring premiums down. You remember those discussions that this is a way to get health care costs down and reduce premiums. In fact, what we're learning, and there's a new report out this week, premiums are going up. We were promised that Americans would be able to keep the insurance they have, and that was a specific commitment made. And yet millions of Americans are losing the insurance that they have. And it's insurance that they like, and they can't keep it. We were promised that if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Everything will be fine, when in fact, again, many Ohioans and many Americans are losing their doctor. We were also told that Obamacare would help grow the economy and create jobs. And unfortunately, just the opposite is happening. More Americans are looking for work because many of the jobs that are available now are part-time, in part because of Obamacare encouraging more part-time work. There are companies that aren't expanding because they don't want to reach that magic 50 employees. And as we talk today, we are learning that there's even more problems with the implementation of Obamacare. Recall that one of the Democrat colleagues here on the floor said that he thought this implementation was going to be difficult. In fact, one Democrat who was prominent in the legislation said it's likely to be a train wreck. Well, unfortunately, that train wreck is occurring. We see the District of Columbia, this week making changes. We see today, apparently, the administration now saying that the small business part of the exchanges isn't going to go forward as planned. We've already seen a one-year delay in terms of the business mandate, and on and on. So that train wreck is already upon us as we move toward October 1st. Let me give you one example of the impact of Obamacare. In Columbus, Ohio, my home state of Ohio, the Wall Street Journal reported that premiums could increase by as much as 436%. Now, some of my colleagues will take issue with that number. Maybe it's not going to be 436%, but the point is we know it's going to be more expensive. We just don't know how much. And that's part of the uncertainty that the law creates. In other words, sometimes uncertainty is the worst thing, and that's what we're seeing not just in Ohio but around the country. We don't know what the effect is going to be on our families. We don't know what the effect is going to be on small businesses. We don't know what the effect is going to be on our economy. Throughout this debate over the continuing resolution, my colleagues on this side of the aisle have talked about this uncertainty. They have talked about how a showdown going up to a potential government shutdown creates uncertainty in the economy. And I agree. And I don't think we should shut down. And in fact, I'm offering an amendment to say that we should never be shutting down government. It's called No Government Shutdown Amendment. It's bipartisan. In the budget debate, we actually had a few Democrats support it, I'm sure against the urging of their leadership, and I appreciate that. Uncertainty is a problem. But, boy, talk about uncertainty. Again, in the implementation, you have some things delayed, other things not delayed, a lot of confusion about how the legislation is going to work. Every day it seems like we discover a new wrinkle in the law that's going to cost more money and cause more problems in terms of people just understanding what their options are. And the effects of Obamacare, by the way, don't stop at the hospital door, and they aren't just limited to our pocketbooks. If you ask Americans what's the most important issue to them, they'll tell you it's the lack of good jobs, jobs in the economy. Obamacare kills jobs. Take the Cleveland Clinic. Cleveland Clinic, as some of you know, is the largest employer in Northeast Ohio. It's been talked about on the floor by other members. They have about 40,000 employees. And by the way, it's one of the few things that both President Obama and Governor Romney agreed on in the campaign, which was that the Cleveland Clinic is providing cutting-edge health care that should be a model for the rest of the country. They do a terrific job there. A week ago, the Cleveland Clinic announced it's cutting $330 million from its budget. What does that mean? Well, that means a bunch of my constituents from the Cleveland area are going to lose a job. And why is the Cleveland Clinic having to cut $330 million from their budget? According to their own spokesperson, to prepare for increased costs and decreased revenues because of Obamacare. So, look, it's something I've heard about again and again when I visit with small business owners throughout Ohio. I hear it from our employers who say they've got no choice but to freeze growth. I have a friend who runs a small company in the Cleveland area. He's got 47 employees. And he has confided in me, you know what, I'm not going to 50, even though I've got some additional business. He's starting to see a little pickup in his particular sector. He says, I'm not going there. I don't want to get to 50 because I simply don't want the uncertainty and the costs associated with the new mandates and requirements that I would have to endure because of Obamacare. So you have the 49ers, employers who are sticking at 49 or less because they don't want the onerous requirements of Obamacare when they cross that threshold of 50 employees. Others, of course, are reducing hours by folks who already work for them to 40 hours or well under 40 hours because they've got to get under the 30-hour-a-week, again, threshold in Obamacare. So very sad, you know, to go to somebody and say, you know what, you've got to come in at 28 hours now because the health care that I'm going to have to offer under Obamacare is not something I can afford, doesn't fit with our bottom line. And this person is saying, I got a car payment or I got a house payment. This is sad, and it is having an effect. I will tell you in my state, and I know it from talking to people, but I also know it just by looking at what these requirements are doing to small businesses. It's no surprise to me that this underemployment figure we see every month in the employment numbers is growing. That's the people who are not working full-time, but working part-time. Unfortunately, if you look over the last few months, we've seen a big increase in part-time jobs and not full-time jobs. Mr. President, or Madam President, in 2010, I don't think that many of my Democratic friends thought they were voting for a bill that would kill jobs. I really don't. I don't think they would have voted for it. I can't believe that they thought that Obamacare would drive up premium costs and make health care harder to get, as it has. But that is what's happening, and that's why I believe it needs to be repealed and replaced with more sensible reforms. The current health care system, before Obamacare, far from perfect, cries out for reform. But unfortunately, the prescription of Obamacare is not making things better, but worse. I know this is hard to believe, but sometimes Congress makes mistakes. And in this case, in my view, Congress made a big mistake. But we can fix it, and we can replace it with real bipartisan health care reform that does foster an environment where jobs can be created, that does provide for health care to be available, rather than harder and harder to get. We can get there, but only if we start by, in this vote today, saying, let's defund it, let's repeal it, let's replace it with something better. As we learn more about the effects of Obamacare, we're seeing some courage on the other side of the aisle. I know one of my colleagues today on the Democratic side said he could look to delaying Obamacare individual mandate for a year, for instance. And that only makes sense. I mean, we've already told the businesses they're going to get a one-year delay, but a woman or a guy that works at that business is told you've got a mandate even though your business doesn't, and you've got to pay a fine if you don't get health care. So 22 House Democrats voted in favor of delaying the individual mandate as well. So I think on both sides of the aisle you're beginning to see some interest in at least having a delay to be able to try to improve this legislation. But the Senate has the opportunity to speak here this afternoon. We're going to vote on this amendment as to whether or not to defund Obamacare. I've heard from my constituents. I'm sure you've heard from yours. Overwhelmingly, to my colleagues, what I'm hearing is they don't want this law to continue. Do they think the health care system is perfect? No. But again, they think that what Obamacare is offering makes it worse, not better. Republicans can't do it alone. We've got 46 votes here. You need 60. But in an act of bipartisanship and real political courage, maybe we'll have a good result this afternoon and begin this process of moving toward a better system. I urge my colleagues to show that courage so we can turn to a better way, to lower health care costs, to increase health care choices, and ultimately to improve the quality of care for all the families that we represent. Madam President, I yield back my time.
Madam President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Madam President, I rise. I want to take a moment to reflect a little bit on this impasse we find ourselves at. The senator from Indiana is going to join me in a discussion here, and I will have a unanimous consent request along the way here. First of all, as to where we are, as we all know, we are at an impasse here in how to fund the roughly 40% of the federal government that's funded through discretionary spending, the spending that Congress controls, the spending that's supposed to happen through the ordinary appropriation process, but doesn't around here. And as we address this, it's become obvious that every single Republican in the House and the Senate wants to defund Obamacare as a step in the direction of completely repealing this completely unworkable bill. But all the Democrats support Obamacare, and they want to implement it, and they want to fund it, and they want to move forward. Well, the impasse arises, obviously, because the Democrats can't have their way in the House, where the Republicans are in control, and we Republicans can't have our way in the Senate, where the Democrats are in control. So, Madam President, I have a suggestion. My suggestion is maybe there's a third way. Maybe this doesn't have to be completely binary. Maybe this doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing proposition in which one side completely wins and the other side completely loses. Now, I would hope that even among my Democratic friends who are big fans of Obamacare, I would think that there's nobody who actually thinks that's a perfect bill. I can't imagine that when the American public has made it clear overwhelmingly their opposition to this bill, when you can't pick up a newspaper in America today without reading a front-page story about the huge problems and costs and negative effects that Obamacare is creating. I can't imagine that anyone thinks this is all perfect. So here's my suggestion. Why not repeal a few of the more egregious flaws that have been acknowledged as flaws on both sides of the aisle? Those things that are not working, that are most problematic, just a few. Couldn't we do that and at least make some progress? So the three items that I have in mind are the subject of my unanimous consent request. One would be repeal of the medical device tax, which is one of the most egregious flaws in this badly flawed bill, and I'll speak some more about this tax in a little while. A second would be to delay for 1 year the individual mandate, and I think Senator Coates from Indiana is going to speak a little bit more about how important it would be to delay that individual mandate. And the third would be to protect the religious freedom of those who object based on deeply held religious views. They object to the contraception mandate that is imposed on them, including faith-based institutions. So I'm going to request that we consider these amendments. That's all. Just asking for an up or down vote on these amendments. I think that's a pretty reasonable request. Every one of these has had bipartisan support. By the way, the repeal of the medical device tax, that was supported by 79 senators. Two-thirds of the Democratic senators voted in favor of an amendment to repeal the medical device tax, and every single Republican. That's not even controversial anymore, to repeal the medical device tax. They all have some level of bipartisan support. Taken together, they're about budget neutral. Repeal of the medical device tax would cost the government some revenue, but the delay of the individual mandate would save the government expenses, so it's about revenue neutral. This could probably speed up the whole process. If we allowed these amendments, frankly, they'd probably all pass. And if they became part of the underlying bill, and if Senator Reid has the votes to pass the amendment that he wants to pass, what would go back to the House would probably pass the House. And it probably wouldn't have to get ping-ponged back here and risk a government shutdown. And finally, Madam President, it would break this impasse. And it would demonstrate that we're at least able to come together on the things where there's bipartisan agreement. So I think the most reasonable thing in the world is to have the vote. That's all. I don't know for sure how it'll turn out. I think it'll pass because these items have demonstrated bipartisan support before, but I think it's unreasonable not to be able to have the vote. And so, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the pending amendments be set aside and it be in order to call up the following amendments, which are at the desk. Number 1971, to repeal the medical device tax. Number 1972, to delay the individual mandate. Number 1973, to protect the religious freedom. And I further ask consent that each amendment be limited to up to 1 hour for debate, equally divided in the usual form. I further ask consent that following use or yielding back of time on each of the amendments, the Senate proceed to a vote in relation to each amendment with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
Senator from Montana.
I object.
Objections heard. Senator from Indiana.
Madam President, I thank my colleague in Pennsylvania for his efforts here. I very much share the same sentiment and the same concerns that he has about going forward here. You know, we're going to vote sometime today, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps Saturday. I think it's still a little bit in limbo as to when it is. We've had a week-long effort here undertaking a very, very important issue, serious to the future of the American people's health and to the American economy. I think it's pretty clear that there are a couple of hard truths that we have to recognize as we come to this vote. I'm still hopeful that when we come to this vote, whether or not to defund Obamacare, that we will be able to see at least 5 of our colleagues from across the aisle come and join us on this. We've heard about, and we're reading about every day, and we have for months, about the impact of the rollout of the Health Care Act and the mess that it has created, the confusion, the things that we are learning about this, the egregious taxes that are attached to this. My colleague has talked about the medical device tax. In Indiana, it's one of our key industries, providing high wages, highly skilled positions for people. It is a product that is exported around the world, helps our balance of trade. It has provided health relief and had provided saving lives to millions of people. Some of these innovations that come out of Warsaw or in Bloomington or other parts of Indiana from the companies that are in the medical device business are truly extraordinary. And yet they got socked as a pay-for the Obamacare Act by a 2.3% tax on their gross sales, not on their profits. So a company, perhaps they're developing a new product, and they come to a point where they know they're not going to make a profit for 2 or 3 years, but they know they've got something here that's really going to work, really going to provide life-saving or life-enhancing benefits. And so they lose money. But they're selling the product. The sales haven't yet caught up with all the research costs, and so they report a loss at the end of the year, or maybe a break even. Now, if that happened to any American individual or any other company, that loss, they would not be taxed. But these companies are being taxed 2.3% on the total amount of money that they take in, even though that money doesn't reach a profit. That's just an egregious, offensive, unbelievable. I mean, who could think up stuff like this? And who could vote for stuff like this? So that's one part of 3 parts of which my colleague from Pennsylvania has offered here. I regret that it has been objected to. So we won't even have a chance to debate it. We won't have a chance to vote on it. We won't have a chance to put our yay or our nay in terms of where we stand. And the real tragedy of this is that a majority of Democrats voted on the budget to repeal this egregious tax. I'd be happy to
yield. The senator from Indiana pointed out exactly correctly the nature of this tax. It's extremely unusual that we choose to punish a company based on its sales, irrespective of whether it's making any money at all. Senator Coates observes this is 2.3% tax on sales. I just want to touch on some of the real-world consequences that are happening right now in Pennsylvania, because this tax went into effect on January 1.
Correct.
And